Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lisa Palmer. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I'd like to make an acknowledgement of country. As the chair of the School of Geography Engagement Committee here at the University of Melbourne, I would acknowledge the elders and descendants of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples who have been and are the custodians of the lands where our Melbourne campuses are located. We acknowledge that this land was the place of age-old ceremonies, of celebration, initiation, and renewal, and that the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands. We recognise their continuing connection to land, sea, and community, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. It's with great pleasure that I will now introduce to you Associate Professor David Bissell, who will be speaking to us this evening on the topic of COVID-19 and geography, what it means for Melbourne. So this public seminar is part of our commitment as a school to enrich and communicate knowledge about the diversity of human and environment relations and contribute to the creation of just societies and sustainable environments, or the more pressing tasks in the context of our current global health pandemic. So David is an Associate Professor and Australian Research Council Future Fellow in the School of Geography. His research explores the geographical consequences of different sorts of mobility, from the daily commute to the longer distance work-related travel, and is interested in how these sorts of mobility are changing our relationships with people and places. He works collaboratively on this with Dr. Libby Strawn in the School of Geography and Professor Andrew Gorman Murray, a geographer based at the University of Western Sydney. David's most recent project is exploring how on-demand mobile work associated with the gig economy is changing how we consume and work in Melbourne. He assists a group of 7 graduate researchers in the school who are undertaking projects that relate to mobilities, technology and work. His book, Transit Life, How Community is Transforming Our Cities, was published in 2018 by MIT Press. I will hand over to David to present his timely public seminar on COVID-19 and geography, what it means for Melbourne. But following this post-seminar discussion will be moderated by Vicky Zhang, who is also a member of our school's engagement committee and one of David's PhD students. So please type in questions in the Q&A function as we go, and Vicky will be able to see and will moderate the discussion of these at the end. Thanks, David.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And I too would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. And I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging of the Wurundjeri. So thanks so much for tuning into this lecture today. It's probably quite accurate to say that the past few months have been some of the most challenging for many people living here in this city. So many of the aspects that make Melbourne such a wonderful experience for so many people have been dramatically interrupted by the COVID-19 crisis and of course the need for a lockdown. And everybody has been forced to find new ways of carrying on with life under new and very challenging circumstances. Now, it's been very gratifying here in Australia that epidemiologists and public health experts have been front and centre during the crisis, rightly guiding the government's response. However, as we emerge from this locked down situation, I want to suggest that geographers offer some really useful ideas for making sense of our current situation. So what's happened, what we might be feeling at this time, and how we might go forward as a city in Melbourne. Now, as Lisa's already intimated, one of geography's central concerns has been about understanding the relationship between people and places and the kind of processes that shape those relationships. And I want to suggest in this lecture to you that understanding the changing meanings and significance of mobility during this crisis can help to make sense of at least some of these changing relationships. Now, just to give you a bit of signposting, my talk is going to be in 3 parts today. The first part is going to be a bit kind of backward leaning. I'm going to think about life pre-pandemic, if we can remember that far back. Then the second part of the presentation, I'll briefly talk about the lockdown itself. And the third part is a little bit more speculative and future leaning. And there I want to introduce some ideas about how we might want to proceed as a city from here. Okay, so to begin, one of the statistics that continues to amaze me is provided by the mobility theorist John Urry, who reminds us that in the 1800s, people used to move on average by only about 50 meters every day. So put simply, people's lives were very, very local. But by the early 21st century, people moved on average a whopping 50 kilometers a day. So from 50 meters to 50 kilometers in that time. Now, of course, as with all generalizations, this masks some pretty big differences, pretty big geographical differences. Of course, many people have had to move large distances for a long time, but it does indicate just how much our world has come to be defined by the movement of people, objects, information, and ideas. Now, in the 1980s, as international trade and travel was growing exponentially during that time, geographer David Harvey developed the concept of time-space compression to describe how the rise of mobility was altering our sense of the world. So as this diagram here on the right of the screen indicates, time-space compression refers to a sense of a shrinking world at a time where spatial barriers, certainly around trade, for example, and our perception of distance was decreasing. Now, this was a really big deal because it dramatically changed how we imagine the idea of place. And again, this map here is a visual representation of that. It no longer made sense to see places as self-contained, relatively unchanging entities, because with all this mobility going on, it became much more important to understand how places were formed through their relationships with other places. And of course, this is so true when we think of somewhere like Melbourne. If we think of what makes Melbourne an amazing and vibrant place to be for so many people, think here of a favourite street in Melbourne and think about taking a walk along it. What do you see? What do you hear? You might glimpse a billboard advertising a gig for a band based in LA and an orchestra visiting from Taiwan. A businesswoman just flown in from interstate gets out of a taxi, pulling a small suitcase. A little further on, you pass a shop where you can buy freshly baked Lebanese flatbreads, and a group of young people enjoying shisha pipes sit on chairs on the pavement. A family group passes you by, clearly excited to be here. They're clutching a guidebook and taking photographs. To your right, a service has just finished at a Greek Orthodox church, and people are spilling down the steps. You wait to cross the road, but you notice a passing minibus is taking tourists to the Great Ocean Road. You decide to pop into your usual coffee shop, and the barista that you've known for a few years updates you on his mother's health in India. Now, for geographer Doreen Massey, place is not a static and unchanging thing. Place is a process that's formed through all of these globally interrelated movements coming together. So Doreen Massey really transformed our geographical ideas of place beyond the idea of just a dot on a map to appreciate how it's through movements, both big and small, that make a place like Melbourne what it is, that gives it its character. Now, of course, as you might be thinking, our own movements are a really large part of what contributes to this global sense of place. And in fact, a while ago, Swedish geographer Torsten Hägerstrand knew this really well, and he developed this kind of intriguing technique of drawing space-time paths to visualize and I suppose to kind of shine a light onto how our sense of place is formed through movements between places. So this simple rendering on the right of the screen here shows how your day or a few hours in the morning might be formed at 3 places, but it's about the movement between those 3 places that really matters. So think about your own daily space-time paths before the pandemic. How long were they, and where did they take you? For many of you, my guess is that these space-time paths would be really quite extensive because before the pandemic, the average commute in Melbourne was around 15 kilometres between places of home and places of work. And in fact, people on average travelled about 65 minutes every day in cars, buses and trains. I'm guessing that some of you might have travelled even further distances, not just in and out of Melbourne from surrounding places in regional Victoria, but all kinds of work-related travel involving overnight stays that effectively loops this city in Melbourne to various other places in Australia and overseas. Now, there are many, many people in Melbourne that undertake this kind of work. So fly in, fly out travel for weeks at a time. Mobile health workers that travel into regional areas. Agricultural workers that travel to live in Sunraysia in harvest seasons. IT workers, project managers. These people regularly zip between capital cities using flights as many of us use trams on a day-to-day basis. Push further, we got used to a situation where if we had enough money, we could even fly to the other side of the world in less than 24 hours. It's something that still astounds me, actually. And such opportunities were, of course, made even more plentiful with the rise of budget flights. So my point here that I'm trying to make is that all of this mobility enabled certain experiences to take place. All of this mobility enabled people to meet up, to see people, to visit places, to undertake work. But of course, as I'm trying to intimate, all of this mobility also contributed to our sense of place in Melbourne in really very distinctive ways. So again, think here about how spaces of transport give rise to all kinds of chance encounters. Think of how we look at strangers and we wonder about their worlds. We fashion sociabilities. We learn new things about others and ourselves in the process. And I have to say, for me, the significance of these public spaces is really attested to by the sheer number of films that are set in them. And I recently enjoyed Jim Jarmusch's wonderful 1991 film, Night on Earth. Very zany, but I fully recommend. It's an anthology film that zooms in on the dramas that unfold in 5 different taxi rides across 5 different cities across the world on one night. So films like this really highlight the value of these public spaces. They're literally where we figure out how it is, what it is to be a citizen and to be social through our encounters with others. Now, during March, of course, all this mobility suddenly came to a grinding halt in Melbourne and around the world. As the COVID-19 lockdown kicked in and many people were prevented from leaving home, except of course for essential trips, even though we were living in the same city as before, our sense of place in Melbourne radically changed. So thinking back to those time-space paths of Hegerstrand, our daily space-time paths really shrunk, and suddenly they looked very different. Daily commutes became a walk between the bedroom and kitchen table for many, and non-work travel was reduced to an infrequent shopping trip and maybe a walk around the block for exercise. With all this restricted movement, gone were so many of the things that make Melbourne buzz: the cafes, the bars, the restaurants, the nightlife, the galleries, the sports, social meetups, you name it, all of those things that you probably missed yourselves. Gone were those very intangible but very real atmospheres that get under our skin and make the favourite parts of our city exactly what they are. So rather than being characterised by connection and mobility, Melbourne suddenly felt disconnected and still. And in fact, we can probably all recollect our own emotional responses to this disconnection, perhaps claustrophobia, loneliness, even depression, as our daily existence was reduced to smaller and smaller bubbles. Suddenly, all of those habits that we'd developed to carry us through daily life without really thinking too much suddenly didn't seem particularly useful anymore. Many of us had to figure out a new way of life, some having to accommodate the trials and tribulations of homeschooling, inflicting new dilemmas, of course, about the equitable divisions of labour, whilst others had to navigate even more emotionally challenging domestic situations. If we looked outside, our main roads were reduced to a trickle of cars and ghost trams, and the skies above us that form the world's 4th busiest air corridor between this city and Sydney fell silent, a really strange feeling. Images of vast banks of planes stored side by side on desert runways seemed to encapsulate this feeling of a grounded world. Suddenly, places that seemed previously within reach suddenly seemed very far away. Migrant families separated over vast distances had very little chance of being able to see each other in person, certainly for the foreseeable future. Closer to home, day trips out to the beach or bushwalking became impossible dreams. And even the CBD with its twinkling towers seemed like it existed on another plane, an otherworldly and inaccessible mirage floating on the horizon, almost a reminder of a previous age. In short, the time-space compression that geographers have written about so extensively seemed to be being reversed. And in this new COVID-19 world, our felt sense of distance was expanding as things were slowing down. So what we might have been seeing is time-space expansion. Now, this time-space expansion became felt in periods of waiting and delay, things that we probably all experienced on a day-to-day basis. In an on-demand world where so many people had become so used to having what they want, when they want it, and going where they want to, suddenly these desires and aspirations had to be put on hold. We had to be patient. Deliveries were delayed, and instant gratification was impossible. Perhaps most significantly, and going back to the theme that I mentioned in the first part of the lecture, the meaning of mobility changed. Remember, we'd got used to mobility being a positive and enabling thing. Mobility was what made this city dynamic and exciting through its relationships with other places. And now, all of a sudden, mobility was the problem. Now, geographers have explained that certain kinds of mobility have very often, been framed as suspicious or negative. And in fact, if we think back to the rise of particular technologies of transport, so the rise of the railways in the 19th century, for instance, this mobility was greeted by, well, certainly the owners of the means of production with delight. You know, they were going to move their goods, of course. But for others, this mobility was threatening to place, potentially eroding its character. And in fact, if we fast forward to the 1970s, many geographers then were also really worried about how intensified mobility would somehow dilute places, making them feel the same, such that some geographers even feared the rise of what Edward Ralph refers to as placelessness, a very provocative claim. But this mobility threat was a really, really different sort. The lockdown was all about reducing the mobility of this coronavirus. But this was a mobility, of course, that was imperceptible. We couldn't see it. Like a hidden stowaway, the virus is parasitic on people, it's carried by people. And suddenly, it was the mobility of other people that became threatening. Now, of course, as we all know, the solution to this problem was physical distancing, or as it's called in the by policy people, social distancing, although I'm not a massive fan of the term, being apart from other people. So when we left our houses, we were greeted by a very, very different Melbourne. The vitality of our favourite streets had gone. Businesses were closed. Tourists were deserted. We walked for exercise. We swerved to avoid others. We queued outside supermarkets. We wiped down surfaces of baskets and trolleys. We shopped quickly and anxiously, and we went back home. Some people even left Melbourne, heading for second houses in rural Victoria, agitating locals and exacerbating new tensions over who exactly belongs to the place. And of course, we all wondered, when will this be over? So now we're 3 weeks on from the first lockdown restrictions being lifted, and a little over a week since the second set of restrictions have been lifted, and our place in Melbourne is shifting yet again. We might sense a palpable feeling of excitement that some of the experiences that we've been missing can resume. Many of us may have had friends over. We might have gone for a bushwalk. We might have had a meal out. After becoming habituated over a few months to such short journeys around our local neighbourhoods, even leaving one suburb now can feel like an Odyssean adventure, even threatening agoraphobia. It's a really, really strange experience to feel so disoriented in a place that is so familiar. But why do we feel like this? Well, in recent times, geographers like Michelle Lobo have contributed important ideas about how who we are is as much an effect of the things that we do, both big and small, and the encounters that we have, rather than it being determined by a kind of fixed sense of identity. So many of us have had to change our day-to-day life so much that our sense of who we are might have become a bit unstuck. Because our ontological security is usually anchored by a need for predictability and control of a situation, and reasonably so, when we're not sure about what's actually going on, when we can't plan for the future, things can feel a bit up in the air. Sometimes it can even be really difficult to know exactly how to feel about something, which can itself feel potentially very disorienting. So it's therefore very, very understandable that the question on many people's lips at the moment is, when will things return to normal? When will life return to normal? But of course, it's worth asking ourselves, is this desirable, this return to a supposed normality? Is this even possible? If we were to cast our mind back to pre-pandemic days, were our lives really most optimal back then? I have to say, what's really interested me throughout the past few months is that it also kind of presumes that we knew what was going on before this pandemic, that's with some sort of certainty, and that our relations with the world were somehow known and coherent. But again, we might want to stop and pause at this moment to think, was this really the case? Again, what I'm trying to suggest here is that it's very easy for events of disruption to usher in kind of imaginative, sort of romanticized ideas about a prior state of coherence. And in fact, as literary scholar Lauren Ballant reminds us, the idea of normality itself is a kind of fantasy. In her words, it's a kind of infrastructure that keeps people afloat by providing the comfort of not having to justify one's actions or one's being. And in fact, we're now told that we need to get used to the new normal. You know, this is such the kind of buzzword that we often hear bandied about, which indicates a situation that of course can't be snapped back to a previous time. What we're living in right now is of course not a normal situation. Melbourne has changed. We have changed, again in subtle but significant ways. We can't go back to normal. We all bear some scars, and some people carry larger traumas. But as geographer Steve Graham writes, experiences of disruption can be really, really useful learning experiences because they can provide opportunities to think about how we might move forward in a situation. And of course, disruption also shines a light onto the politics of a situation that might otherwise have been obscured, again, by its very habituality. In other words, what I'm trying to ask here is, can we use our current situation to move forward in a more just and equitable way? Now, I will just say at this stage, I'm not going to be making any grand proclamations about what the virus is doing. And I've heard various other people proclaiming it as the end of capitalism or the end of the Anthropocene. And certainly these are very bold and provocative claims. But again, it presumes that we know what is going on in this moment and what will unfold. So I guess slightly more modestly, I do think that this moment does provide an opportunity to reconfigure our futures and a more equitable future, but this does involve pausing to think about what we want. For me, I think there are some really fundamental questions that remain about the role of mobility in shaping this city, for example, especially as it's become clearer that in spite of Australia's efforts to suppress the virus, this is still a really fragile situation that could dramatically change, as Dan Andrews, our Premier, often reminds us. So lockdown being raised is forcing really big questions about how we will move about in Melbourne, and crucially, as a geographer, what this means for our sense of place. So what I want to do in this final part of the presentation today is I want to take you to 3 spaces in Melbourne to think about how we might move forward. And what I want to do in each of those spaces is draw out some of the political implications that we might want to consider. Okay, so the first space that I want to take us to is this space here, a very empty looking Federation Square. And I'm bringing you here to think about what a post-COVID-19 world means for our public spaces. And the sorts of movement, I guess, that I want to think about here are the small-scale movements between people. Now, as geographers have long argued, spaces like Federation Square are a really important part of city life. Squares are emblematic public spaces. But of course, these squares and these public spaces also includes the streets that we were visualizing earlier, pulsing to the rhythms of different people moving through. So there's spaces where we move through. They're also spaces where we assemble, where we sit, where we protest, where we play, where we debate. Crucially, they're spaces where we participate in urban life with other people. Now, geographers have long been at the forefront of debates around the politics of public spaces. So what is permissible to do in them? How is this decided upon? How are they managed? Who do these public spaces exclude? But as the lockdown retreats, we're left with some really important questions about how public life will take place. Now, of course, what's been really very noticeable in recent weeks are some of the new interpersonal dynamics that are unfolding between people in public spaces. So geographers like Eric Loria, who studies small-scale movements between people, has shown that there's actually an awful lot going on in even the most apparently simple everyday public situations, such as when someone's kind of coming at you in the street and you have to do an awkward in-the-moment negotiation. Now, of course, these sorts of negotiation have changed. Some people arc out to avoid being so close to others, walking out into the street, and this might be acknowledged by a nod or a smile. And in fact, not doing this can be, you can be reprimanded by a glare or a tut. While the prevalence of face masks in Melbourne certainly hasn't been as marked as in other cities around the world, maybe their time will come. And of course, this too will potentially change how people relate to each other in public spaces, mirroring the screened off interactions that are taking place in many shops at the moment. But pushing beyond the city square itself, physical distancing also means that we will likely miss other collective events. So think of how things like the White Night Light Projection Festival in the CBD is a brilliant example of the city coming together, or even being part of a crowd heading to the MCG. Part of the buzz about these events comes from being able to experience the city together. It seems very weird doing that on our own, right? Of course, think too about how certain kinds of political action are now potentially much more difficult, or certainly require other precautions. So public protests rely on the energy of crowds to create their force, to make their point. I have to say, when I wrote this lecture over a week ago now, I was going to refer to the protests that happened outside Parliament House recently in protest of the immobility of the lockdown. But of course, since then, there have been incredible protests in Melbourne and around the world in response to the horrific killing of George Floyd and the wider issues of systematic, centuries-old racial injustice that his death reflects, both in the States, here and elsewhere. And it's been amazing and inspiring seeing this surge of support. But of course, there's also a nervousness about how such close proximity could potentially spread the virus and compromise the health of those that are most vulnerable, especially given that COVID-19 disproportionately impacts people whose health has been compromised by systematic injustice through pre-existing differences in communities' wealth, health, and living arrangements. So the ways that we relate to each other in motion are changing, becoming used to not being so close, possibly. Now, Eric Loria says this might seem quite insignificant, but it actually tells us an awful lot about how we navigate and gauge our changing responsibility to other people, especially when we consider the new kinds of generosity and suspicion that are unfolding as we move through Melbourne. So each of these restrictions on our micro-mobilities with others in public, I think, pose really important questions about how we might do public life differently in a COVID-19 world. While the move of some sorts of public events online, such as this, might be helpful in creating new places of togetherness and new opportunities for debate, such space, of course, might also create new sorts of inequalities along the digital divides that geographers such as Lisa Moore have been describing for some time. Attention to these micro-mobilities of city life also raise important questions about the kinds of policing that are going on. And of course, it's often tempting to think about policing and certainly power being wielded from above, such as by state and federal governments. You know, that's where a lot of people have been looking at in the last few months as to where kind of direction has been coming from. But of course, many of the situations that I've described show how there are whole kinds of kind of micropolitics, new kinds of self-disciplining and policing of others that's been going on in public. Yet in other cities, a more top-down policing has, of course, taken on a different form, with robot dogs being used in some parks in Singapore, for example, to disperse crowds of people, reminding people to keep a distance. And this shows how things like automation are becoming kind of front and center in terms of the pandemic response. But we need to ask ourselves, what are we sacrificing if we allow such policing to become institutionalized and prevalent? Okay, so we're going to turn from Federation Square and we're going to move across the road to the second space I want to take you to today, which is the interior of the number 1 tram, in part because it's the one that's nearest to me. So of course, trams are such an iconic symbol of this city, and they're a crucial part of our public transport infrastructure, which of course includes metro trains, buses, and other things. Yet as some people return to work across the city, these transit spaces that used to be heaving during peak hours are notably quiet. Being in public transport, of course, involves potentially heightened exposure to the coronavirus, because these are high density spaces that require being in tight proximity to other people. Now, it's interesting, a previous project on commuting that I did, I lost track of the number of people that who would refer to the interior of buses and trains as virus and germ capsules. So it wasn't just the time pressure of the commute or the sometimes frustrating behaviours of other commuters that got people down. It was anxieties about getting sick, especially when stuck next to a sniffer or a sneezer, and the knock-on implications to people's family life and capacity to work and enjoy life, of course. Now, of course, some bodies experience these risks more acutely than others, especially those who are immunocompromised. Now, it seems that such suspicions have been heightened by COVID-19, and we're being recommended to avoid travelling by public transport if at all we can. So high-density public transport infrastructures that have been at the heart of progressive urban planning are simply finding it very, very difficult to cope in a COVID-19 era. Trains and buses are reaching maximum capacity at 10%. Other cities are even toying with the idea of having booked time slots to travel to spread the morning and evening peaks. But of course, this reduces some of the flexibility that makes high-frequency public transport desirable. Now, all of this means that the private car has come back into its own of late, offering a protective cocoon that shields people from each other whilst in transit. And of course, this has massive implications for carbon emissions and also for congestion as more cars clog up Melbourne's roads. Now, I know that heated debates are taking place across the city at the moment about who has the right to car parking spaces. You know, these sound sort of mundane, but they're huge. And of course, car parking spaces are already at a premium in the city. And some businesses are even having conversations about hiring extra car parking capacity. So all of this raises some really tricky questions about whether the hard-won battles of the past few decades to change people's travel habits, to switch to public transport, have been lost in an instant. So what about the viability of public transport in the long run, especially if COVID-19 is something that we have to live with for many years, and we're being told that that is a distinct possibility? And there are important equity issues at stake here too. When we can consider, well, who exactly can afford to run a car or two cars and pay those high parking fees that are charged in city centres? Now, in my own research on commuting, many people really valued their time on public transport as kind of me time to do the things that they wanted to do that they couldn't have done at work and at home. So playing games, watching a series on Netflix, even catching up on sleep. So what will we miss out on if we can't benefit from what spaces of public transport provide us with? We might also question whether COVID-19 disrupts some of the futuristic visions that have been put in development by certain technology companies about the seductions of platoons of shared, on-demand, autonomous vehicles. Now, I think where it previously felt like there was a bit of a path dependency about such proclamations, right at this moment, these bright futures of shared, autonomous mobility don't necessarily seem so inevitable or necessarily desirable. In fact, think of how in the UK, car sharing has been touted as a solution to not going on public transport, but only if driver and passenger are kind of looking away from each other, which reveals just how challenging such a solution is. Or are there simpler solutions that a city like Melbourne could follow, like mandating face masks for all users of public transport to limit the transmission of the virus? Okay, the final space I want to take you to, being on the tram, is actually here, my home, although I guess in a way you have been here for the past 30 minutes or so. Now, in spite of the lockdown lifting, we're still being told to work from home if we can. And so many of us have been sat at makeshift desks like this one, as Zoom and Teams have become the verbs for work interaction. Now, for many of us, this is reducing the need to do a daily commute. And it might be especially beneficial for those long-distance commuters from outer metro or regional areas who are benefiting especially from the time savings of not commuting. Now, of course, home working or telecommuting, to give it its kind of faintly historical whiff, has a long history, and there are long-standing geographical debates in Australia about how the rise of telecommuting actually went hand in hand with opportunities for sea changing and tree changing, where people moved out of cities in search of a different lifestyle. But of course, what is really distinctive about this present moment is how so many people are being forced to work from home. And so geographical debates on the future of work and the place of work are now firmly back on the agenda and under the spotlight. Now, some research has shown that we do indeed need face-to-face contact to develop trust with people that we're working with, and of course a whole lot of other things. But perhaps the COVID-19 era, perhaps in this era, we've become skilled at navigating virtual co-presence. But what about having contact with other people, those serendipitous interactions that make some workspaces enjoyable places to be? Now, in this time, the rise of virtual working could boost the rationale for things like co-working spaces in suburban communities and regional centres. So these are physical spaces that people use to be around others and to make a clearer separation between home and work. And Lily Krovara, a PhD researcher in our school, is currently doing a really excellent project that's looking at the potentials of co-working spaces for regional Victoria, which will be really fascinating in this COVID time. Furthermore, during the lockdown, we've also witnessed the rise of digital socializing as never before, with friends and family meeting online for quarantine drinks and even watching movies at a distance. But again, there are really significant political implications about this changing role of home space. For a start, there are privacy issues to consider here, of course. Perhaps never before have our private spaces been made so public as we allow other work colleagues and strangers into our most intimate spaces. But more than this, we would do well to remember geographer Dori Massey's important point that all mobilities are caught up in what she calls power geometries. In other words, our actions, all of our actions, have knock-on impacts for other people. We're never just acting in a vacuum, even if we think we are. So in this case, the mobility of some requires the mobility of other people. So in fact, it's really curious in that regard that after associating some forms of mobility with freedom for such a long time, now it's a particular sort of immobility that is becoming privileged. But in order for us to be still, to work from home, requires the mobility of others. So think here of some of the workers that might have come to your door over the past few months. You might have ordered from Uber, Deliveroo and Easy, getting a takeaway meal delivered, Ozpost delivering your parcels. You might have got a grocery delivery from Woolies. And of course, beyond those coming to your home, going to the shops, going to the doctors, requires other people to be on the move for you, stocking shelves, delivering blood samples, and so on. So whilst locked down, whilst we felt that sense of stuckness, there has been a whole world of logistics that's continued to operate that involves driving, hotel workers, security guards who must continue to travel. Fly in, fly out workers continue to fly out to mine sites from Perth, and healthcare workers, agricultural workers, and other distance workers must continue to travel. And because they must continue to travel, they are at a heightened risk. In short, what we're seeing is the result of a new mobile power geometry that's based on exposure to the virus. And of course, we would do really well to consider how such power geometries might be intensifying forms of class difference as the inability of working from home maybe becomes a privilege only afforded to those in traditionally white-collar jobs. Okay, I'm going to bring this to a bit of a conclusion here. So at the present time, in the absence of a vaccine or widespread treatments, COVID-19, frustratingly, seems here to stay. What I hope to have convinced you of in this talk is that epidemiological and public health expertise of dealing with the outbreak need to be paired with a geographical sensitivity to how COVID-19 is changing the relationships between people and place. And for me, this is where geography comes in. As a discipline that has been driven by the quest to think about how the complex relationships between people and place changes, my suggestion to you today is that geography matters now more than ever as we try and move forward and refashion our lives in the long comet tail of COVID-19. Now, one of the key characteristics of research being undertaken in the School of Geography at the University of Melbourne is an attention to the politics of place. So those in control, those on the receiving end to the processes that make up places. I'm really fortunate to have such a wonderful team of colleagues and graduate researchers that are all experts in their field, working on brilliant projects that are looking at how places are changing. And in walking you through these three spaces of the city today and giving some speculation about how they are changing, what I hope to have shown to you today is how questions of mobility, so how much, in what way, and by whom, are front and centre of this politics of place in Melbourne. And also what I hope to have shown is that far from the great equaliser, COVID-19 is creating new power relations in Melbourne that might be benefiting some people, but of course leaving others out. To end on a slightly more optimistic note, though, what the pandemic response, I think, has shown is that we can change our everyday habits if we have to. And I think that this is an exciting realization, meaning that some of the massive challenges that we still need to crack, especially in relation to climate change, might be a little bit more within our grasp, or at least more so than previously we might have thought. So thank you very much for listening. I'm now going to hand over to Vicky Zhang, who has been busily collating your questions.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, David, for the cautious, I also thought quite like optimistic presentation, actually, with its very rich description of the tumultuous inner life of the pandemic and its trajectory. I also really liked your pre-COVID description of life in Melbourne, because it seems like a very accurate description of, I live in Brunswick, of basically of Sydney Road at kind of any time of day or night. Romantic, but also very accurate. And I also loved your use of the words ghost trains, which I will, ghost trams, sorry, which I'll endeavour to use more because, it's great. So as Lisa mentioned, my name's Vicky. I'm a PhD student here in the school. And we've got about 15 minutes for questions, and I'll be just reading them out. They can be posed, just to reiterate, via the Q&A box at the bottom. And I'll just prioritize by most popular questions as they come, and maybe pop in one of my own, I suppose, if that works for you, David.
For sure.
Excellent. So my first question is from Laura, I want to say Horton, so sorry, Laura, which is, I have a question which stems from perhaps a less positive view of mobility. Could the transition to online work help to end the division between town and country? For example, in accordance with the dreams of utopias past? Could it bring about a revitalization of rural areas? And adding to that as well, could home life conversely, adding to your point on mobility, sorry, the mobility of some versus others, could home life conversely enable less dependence on deliveries or service workers, maybe enabling time for self-help, gardening, kind of balancing some of those points as well. So,
they're both very, very good reflections and very interesting. I think the point about regional centres, we've seen time and time again in Australia, certainly, policies that try and attract investment out of large cities and into rural centres. And a lot of the reluctance to move economic activity to rural centres is because of the perceived need to be in proximity to other people, to have conversations, to do business. And so I think what's really interesting about this pandemic time is people have been forced, and it's been very uncomfortable and, as I say, very disorienting, to learn new habits of relating to colleagues, of doing things differently. But maybe if we reflect back now, 2 months on, maybe actually we can sort of affirm some of those competencies that we do have now. And maybe that means that that certainly some workplace cultures might change such that there will be more of less of a reluctance, to kind of disallow either home working or various modes of virtual working. It's interesting when I think back to my project on commuting in Sydney, and I interviewed people who wanted to do more home working. Very often the kind of pushback was from bosses and was from workplaces who were essentially reluctant to trust people to get on with doing what it was that they were doing. So I think it'll be really interesting to think about what are the new workplace cultures that COVID and virtual work have given rise to, and will that lead to more trusting relationships in workplaces such that people feel that they can work outside of city centres in places that they might want to live in, and not just in in places that are easily accessible to Melbourne, the Castlemaynes and Dalesfords of the world, even though they're beautiful and wonderful, but places further afield. And in fact, places that a lot of research now, school takes place in Sunraysia, in Shepperton. These are places that have quite different socioeconomic makeups, and it'll be really interesting in the wake of COVID-19 to think about how some of those places will have shifted in their own ways and with their own dynamics. And again, I wouldn't want to speculate on what those changes are, but it will be really important to find out what they are.
I have a perhaps related question to do with work from Candice Boyd about commuting and long commutes. So for people who do very long commutes, who leave home before dark and return after dark, perhaps restricted mobility is a kind of relief. And I know this is something that you've done a lot of work on, David, in the past. People in these inner regional areas have been given an opportunity to reconnect to their local environments. Do you have any further reflections on that?
Yeah, and I think actually when I was putting this lecture together, I in the lockdown period, in the second part of the presentation, I probably was maybe a little bit over negative, in the sense that I didn't draw out at that point some of the positives that people might have been experiencing during that time, and those ideas of reconnection certainly might be very relevant there. Not just in terms of reconnecting to communities that maybe people just feel a part of to sleep, dormitory settlements because of those long commutes, but also reconnecting with their own suburbs in new ways. And again, I'm thinking of research projects that are going on in the school at the moment. Catherine Phillips is doing a fascinating project looking at people's relationships with nature, and specifically with trees, and how they're changing. I was thinking, reflecting on my own experience of this COVID period, how my own relationship to my suburb and certainly the trees have changed really dramatically. So again, this sort of comes back to my kind of hesitancy about making declarations. People ask me, what is changing? Tell me what's changing. But of course, we haven't done research on this yet, which is why I'm being necessarily speculative. So what we do need is geographical research that actually is able to diagnose and get a sense of how people's connections have been changing. So Catherine's project is one. Ellen van Holstein's projects that have been looking at how communities form and emerge and transform. These will be evolving in presumably in all kinds of new ways during this time. So I'm really excited about seeing the work of other people in our school and what insights that's going to reveal.
Yeah. So we've got a question here from the Australian Rivers Institute, kind of flipping that question on the other side, bringing it back to the city. Melbourneites love their lively CBD. Should the intensity of city employment change markedly in the future, if many people work from home, there may be opportunities to enliven more suburban areas and not just the kind of central built up areas. Is this something that's being discussed in your circles? Yeah.
It's a really great question, and again, I suppose relates a little bit to the question about what about the changing status of regional areas. And certainly a lot of the public transport and infrastructure debates in Melbourne are circling around decentering economic activity. So if we think back to the most recent state election and the new loop railway that was the signature Labour package, this was all about linking various suburban centres in Melbourne without having to go into the centre, into the CBD. And so this was partly about, this was kind of a top-down infrastructural kind of fix to try and kind of catalyse some of those intensifications, some of those kind of more suburban activity hubs. But of course, as many geographers have reminded us, I'm thinking here of Kurt Iveson, who I remember once saying to him, referring to suburbia in a blanket way, and he said, "Oh no, you can never do that. Don't refer to suburbia in a blanket way." And I've always, whenever I hear that word, I'm always chided by that, and rightly so. So of course, there are massive differences between the suburbia of Coburg and the suburbia of Thomastown and the suburbia of new kind of edge cities that are springing up on the outskirts of this city. Again, though, I really do hope, and I like to think of myself as an optimist. I do hope that this does provide us with an opportunity to really decenter some of that economic activity and move at least some of it to those outer areas. But of course, also just the caveat to that is that these other centres are not dead. You know, I think there's some, in popular press and in the media, there's often a tendency to refer to the idea that these places are devoid of community and that they're kind of, you know, these wastelands that exist at the edge of the city. Of course, that couldn't be further from the case. Again, we need geographical research that actually shows us the detailed patterned nature of life in these spaces. And if decentering economic activity can contribute to that, then that's fantastic.
So coming to a specific place, we have a question from Kevin Johnson about parks and as public spaces. So have you considered parks as public spaces? They've clearly passed their lockdown use peak. A month ago, they were full with people with fewer recreation options. With more shopping and dining available, they appear to be heading back to typical levels of use. Dog walkers, avid exercisers, kite flyers. At least this has been the case in the inner metro parks, both weekends and weekdays. Do you think this suggests that they're considered largely second choice destinations? How do you equate that idea with the idea that COVID-19 has generated permanent change?
That's a very, very good point. And again, I suppose partly connects back to the research that I was referring earlier. People like Catherine Phillips in our school who are looking at you know, the significance and value accorded to green spaces in our city. And yes, undoubtedly these values and the significance of these spaces will undoubtedly be changing. But it also reminds me of a point that I read last week. It was a Virginia Trioli piece on ABC Radio, and she was talking about how she was really confronted by someone who said to her, well, actually, you know, the fact that lockdown is being lifted and cafes and bars are being reopened, you know, makes me really nervous because I can't afford to go out and I can't afford to socialize with friends in these ways. And I'm finding I'm having to make excuses as to why I can't do this. And so reflecting back on the question in light of that, it's very interesting how parks might have presented themselves as a much more equitable space of socializing, where people maybe didn't feel some of those kind of affective depressions of exclusion that they might feel on a day-to-day basis. You know, the pressures of being sociable in other places and cities. Of course, the value of these places undoubtedly will be changing. And of course, there's always going back to the previous question about urban development, there's always the threat that these public spaces are being threatened by development, economic development, the need for housing. But I think during this time, the sheer number of people using these spaces, and of course using them responsibly, socially distancing, physically distancing, has shown that they are an absolutely integral part of what makes a city, of what we do in cities, and of who we are. I would never, I couldn't imagine a city without these amazing spaces.
So we have another question here from Simon Cook from far away, and shout out, I've noticed a couple of people tuning in from the UK, so thank you for showing up to our Melbourne timed event. So reflecting on the changes to daily mobility and commuting that may be instigated by COVID, is Melbourne seeking to use this as a moment to catalyse greater active transport use, or is it a return to the car seeming inevitable? Has there been any road space relocation, for example, that has been witnessed to better facilitate walking, cycling, running, scooting, etc.?
It's a great question, and thanks, Simon, for tuning in as well. It's a great question, and of course we've seen around the world various sort of, I guess, kind of ad hoc infrastructure changes, as you mentioned. So car lanes being reduced to accommodate more bike lanes, more pedestrian spaces, and of course these are really great things, but they're only great if they lead to kind of changes in the way that these spaces are used all the time. I mean, I think that certainly in Melbourne, I think we're still trying to figure out what those changes are going to be. I guess we have had a bit of a we've had a quite a different situation to maybe some other cities, in that our rate of transmission at the moment is thankfully very low, and so people are making their own decisions about whether they want to risk going out, whether they need to socially distance or not. And again, I'm not making any value judgments here. It's, you know, it's interesting how people are making their own in the moment decisions about you know, whether going on a tram is okay, and then, you know, when they're on the tram, where they sit, those sorts of things. So no, to answer your question more directly, Melbourne, we haven't seen as many infrastructure changes at this moment. There is certainly well-developed strategies for increasing active transit, as there are in many other cities around the world. And of course, this does present another moment to kind of catalyze that. I really, really hope that this does encourage more conversations around infrastructure. And as other people in our university have always argued, I'm thinking here of people like Crystal Legacy, infrastructure, transport infrastructure is always political. It's always up for grabs. We don't need to sit back and take what we're given. So again, this is a moment to actually to think about and pause and think, well, actually, what about that little bit of cycling that isn't wide enough? What about that space? What about those parts of the city that could be made better? Like, this is the time that we need to make these voices heard.
So there are a couple of other questions, but I'm looking at the time and I wanted to ask a question of my own because I have the power, I suppose. So I noticed at the start, or I liked at the start, how you brought up the idea of these kind of time-space paths being interrupted. And I know my understanding anyway of some of Hegerstrand's ideas were that they were really based around this kind of project-based or goal-based idea of how we move through space. And it seems to me that there's a certain, given all the uncertainty, there's a sense that we're not moving or acting in ways that are so intentional, that are so based on action, sure, but not necessarily based on this kind of goal trajectory, intentional trajectory sense of things. And it was really interesting hearing you talk about kind of these habits and these durations involved in building new habits. And I was wondering, because there's been a lot of emphasis on things that will change, I'm thinking more to the side of your work that's more to do with passivity and acquiescence. And obviously we've seen just the adaptability of people in these circumstances. I'm wondering whether you could speak to maybe the provisionality and perhaps the transience of some of the changes, and maybe our passivity to the kind of infrastructures that might be around us, and whether there is the possibility that some things or a lot of things won't change.
Yeah. Of course, it's a really good question. And it reminds me, actually, again, I was reading something a few weeks ago. Transport geographer Tim Schwanen wrote a really interesting blog piece that was kind of doing what you just suggested there. It was sort of, it was almost playing a devil's advocate. You know, there was all of these voices saying that this has changed, this has changed, this has changed, you know, everything has changed. But actually, he was pointing out that, well, actually, no, all of these things we've seen before in various different guises, you know, the sort of spatial segregation of different populations, you know, the kinds of incarceration that people might be experiencing. Like there's a historical precedent for all of this. You know, we only have to think about the work of Foucault, for example, you know, who kind of historicized many of these things that we're talking about here extensively. So I think absolutely your point is an important one, in that we need to think critically about what is changing, and in fact what is new. Again, as geographers, sometimes we have the tendency to claim that lots of things are new where they might not necessarily be. But I think, from me, just going back to the first point of your question, what I found really interesting, and maybe I probably should have played up a little bit more in the presentation, is how disorientation, confusion, and kind of incomprehension, those things, as you say, that we might be experiencing, are not something to be written off. They're not something to be ignored. Yes, they're impasses and they feel uncomfortable. Hell, they feel uncomfortable. But they're also, in those times, there's also space that is opening up, that's asking us questions, that's kind of that allows us to have those moments of reflection on, hang a minute, could I do this thing differently? And what might that look like? Whether it's taking part in a Black Lives Matter rally, or whether it's another thing that maybe you wouldn't have done beforehand. So I think that for me, and I guess what I'm interested in this situation is that that disorientation itself is productive. It might catalyze all kinds of things. And of course, as you say, you know, these things can't be captured on Hegerstrandian type graphs. They need decent, rich social science investigation. And again, all the sorts of work that are happening in our School of Geography are doing precisely that fine-grained, rich examination of social formations that are actually emerging and taking place. So watch this space.
That's a nice corrective, I think, to the more optimistic view, with the kind of implication that the transformations that we might seek to make possible within this time actually is, the discomfort is kind of intrinsic to the possibility of those transformations, and those thresholds are necessarily uncomfortable ones. I think there's something kind of recuperative in a way about that kind of discomfort that we're all feeling, that you very nicely put as being painful.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, very well.
So we're nearing 7 o'clock, or rather we're over 7 o'clock according to my clock. So I think we'll wrap things up here. So I just want to say thank you so much again to David for speaking to us, and for everyone for tuning in this evening, especially those tuning in at weird hours of the day. I just want to make a note to say that the School of Geography, we usually run a seminar series during semester, and we're actually going online for semester 2. So our seminar series is restarting on the 4th of August. It's a Tuesday at 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. David will actually be chairing, and we have Benjamin Hegarty, a Mackenzie Fellow in the School of Political and Social Sciences here at University of Melbourne. And he's doing a presentation on titled Illegal but Non-Conforming Status, the Transgender Body and Spatial Governmentality in Indonesia. So the details and registration will be on our website, and it'd be great to see some of you there. That'll be running all semester. But yes, thank you so much again, David. Thank you everyone, and have a lovely evening or morning or afternoon.
Thanks so much, Vicky, and thanks everyone for joining.